Welcome everyone to the session. The title is probably one of the shortest session titles out of the entire ESA program this year. Working towards AI-readiness Checklist 2.0, and I am Doug Stroud, research scientist with the slides. Come on. Okay, yeah. I am a research scientist with North Carolina State University, which is through the Corporate Institute for Satellite Earth System Studies in North Carolina. I work with NOAA National Centers for Environmental Information. So glad to see many of you in the room as well as online. And so I want to, before we get started, I want to do some logistics to navigate through this session because we're going to have some of the note taking. I hope to have some help from the room as well as online. So I am going to stop sharing the screen and reshare through here. So you will see the screen has changed. So that is try to help you navigate all the things that we need for this session. If you go to sketch page for this session, you will find the resource for the session at the bottom. And that includes, yeah, this is better. Includes the checklist we're going to talk through today on the GitHub. So if you click on that link, that will get you to the Classer's GitHub page, and that provides overall description of the cluster, the data readiness cluster, as well as the goal of the AI readiness assessments and how you can use a checklist for assessments. And within that, if you go specifically into this directory of published checklists, that version 1.0 as a markdown file on the GitHub, where you can find all those information about checklists and all the questions. So I am walking everyone through the resources we're going to have in some discussions later on. So that's the first point of resources I want you to get yourself familiar with through the sketch page. And the other one is a session note document. So this note document is basically a Google Doc created by ESUP. And I encourage everyone to provide your information for the notes, and so we can follow up some of the conversations after the session ended. And also, this is a collaborative document where you can always put in the notes that you have heard or specific thing you heard in the session that we can use to remind ourselves some of the points being discussed in the session today. And the cluster meets every month. And so some of the topics we discuss here today won't be able to be fully addressed within the 90 minutes. I was joking with Matt that we always think maybe 30-minute discussion is too long, and then after a while, it's like 30 minutes is not enough, and we barely scratch the surface of a lot of conversations. So if we can capture all the information in this document, that can be really helpful for us to continue conversations at our monthly cluster call after this July meeting and going into the January meeting. So when we are doing additional things with those topics. And one more thing, we will have the session shared folders, which let me go to this folder where all this notes documents is included here, but also two other resources. One is the slide deck that I'm going to use for today's session, as well as the PDF, which is a draft report from a recent World Data System pilot study. They did some pilot study with 8 different data centers and did some assessments and some feedback from the pilot studies, which will be useful resources for you, especially when you are in the breakout groups that you want to look at improvement to the checklist questions specifically. So before I move on, and any questions about pointing to different parts of the resources, it's all linked to the note document as well. So if you need always go back, you can go back to the note document, link to the slides, link to the draft study reports, and then link to the checklist here. Any issues with accessing the note documents or other things? Hearing none, I assume everyone can access everything, which is great. I am go back to my slides. Also, feel free to stand up if you get like lunch fatigue after you get. Sometimes I had the trouble. I need to stand up, otherwise I'll fall asleep in some of the sessions. Hopefully this is not a session that is gonna do that to you. I think I'm gonna start with one of the slides, just trying to summarizing the conversation had happened so far. And with, I think now AI is an unavoidable topic in both work and life. I was in a coffee shop the other day. The coffee shop in Asheville reopened because it was by the river, so it got destroyed after the flood. It finally reopened after 7 months. I went in there. I want to get a coffee and then just sit by the river, enjoy the nice nature. But then all of a sudden, two people walked up with their coffee, started talking about ChatGPT and AI. I was like, oh, weekend. I don't want to talk about AI, and which I talk for my work every day. But that is just a fact that it's unavoidable for a lot of discussions about AI. And where from earth science part, I think in the CDF session discussion this morning, there are a lot of conversation about how we can help the user using the data become for AI applications. But at the same time, that for the data facility, you can also use AI for the data management, stewardship, and other activities. So I think it's really thinking about how can we improve the data management to support AI, and on the other one is that how AI may demand us to do better data management in ways to support those higher demand data users in that case. So about a year and a half ago, the data readiness cluster within ESIP trying to create guideline, which is what we call the AI-readiness checklist, define 4 different aspects of what we consider AI-ready data, from data documentation, data quality, data access, and data preparation, where data documentation is trying to enable the users to understand what this data set specifically is and whether if to increase usability of the data. Yes. Oh, yeah. Thank you. There we go. And for the data quality is set to help users determine the fit for purpose, which is also a loaded term. Like, what do we mean by fit for purpose? What the purpose is? And the data access is to affecting the both efficiency as well as reproducibility for the research and development process with AI applications, and the data preparation to help us identify those common data services and tools to reduce the burden on the users, right? So if you can provide the data service, help users to filter out those unfit data in the data files, that would be a good service to provide for data preparation. So just a quick show of hands. So how many of you have heard about this checklist? Or, okay, half of the room? And how many of you have opened the checklist? Heard and opened is different thing. Okay. And we do see people raise hand online as well. Thanks, Zach. So we have half of the people in the room have opened, and so it worth to go through it just briefly to give people on the same baseline about what the checklist is about on those things. And I think this also showed up in the CDF conversation earlier. What do we mean by AI ready? So for us, the definition of AI ready is really providing those well-managed data set that can be used by the users easily to develop AI applications specifically. And so But people may have different definitions on how AI ready means to them. So there are some conversation within the community to refine the definition of AI readiness. And there's going to be a triple AI magazine special collection on AI readiness published in, I think, spring next year. That's one of the work we have been doing right now. So for the AI-ready data characteristics setting as baseline, so for the quality that is describing different scientific quality of the data set, including the completeness, consistency, bias, unbiasedness, timeliness, uncertainty information, provenance, and other related qualities. And for the documentation, that includes the standard and common metadata and the tools examples and how the data can be used. And more commonly, people are including notebook examples of how to use those data sets for AI and machine learning application developments. And the data dictionary, identifiers, and license information about those data and how and whether who can use those data for those AI machine learning applications. For the access, that includes questions about data formats, delivery options, and the security and the privacy of those data, and the usage right of those data. Like, is that anyone can use it, or that's limited to certain people? Because there might be, for example, within NOAA, the fisheries, that there's a certain like protected species, those data shouldn't be available to anyone who want to access it. And for the preparation, that includes the training labels or targets and recommended data splits. That's specifically for supervised machine learning, the missing values and outliers being identified, and the recommended techniques for those like data. For example, whether it's good for classification, regression, or different types of the machine learning model specific usage. And if there's any existing examples of how those data has been used for machine learning model development. So those tools can be provided for people. So I think we consider the current efforts for the assessments of the AI readiness as it's really in the same direction with a lot of those modernization of the data management and stewardship, with a lot of the improvement to the data documentation as well as the access and other information there. So this just gives you a quick, we have a template of how to do those assessments. So we have about 40 some questions about different components within the checklist, and to look at whether, for example, in the documentation that's asking if this data metadata follows specific domain standards or convention. For example, if the satellite data, whether they are following the CF convention, and those can be checked against compliance of those. And so with that, that gives you a more positive points towards the readiness for AI applications. And so for the access, that are looking at different questions about formats, the format and whether this format is machine readable or actionable, and information regarding whether the data access requires authentication or not, and that is also included here. Sorry, switching to Mac to Windows is not that helpful after lunch. And for the quality, I think that's one thing that it's not, that is very important for a lot of machine learning developers and application users, that they're looking at different components based on the survey we have done, including timeliness, like how often those data are updated. And so that determines whether the model can be used for operational or near real-time use or not. And then the completeness, that includes the coverage, both spatial temporally, and then for the consistency, oftentimes when you think about some data set may come from different source. For satellite, you have different satellite platforms that sensor may have changed. So if you're trying to do a long-term time series analysis, you want to make sure the time series is consistent across platforms. And the bias is one that's also a loaded question. People always come back with us, what do you mean by bias? Because oftentimes bias for model, bias for observation might define separately. And so that can be tricky for people to answer those questions. And you can see there are more than just one question about bias, and also the quality procedures and provenance of the data. And so that is the part where the assessment of the data set for AI readiness is getting a lot of discussion, but also it's the hardest to automate because sometimes we don't really have those metadata information can be used to do some of those assessment for automation. So recently, we have done some of the pilot activities. One is the UK Met Office and NOAA's Transatlantic Data Science Academy. It's always a long name to say. We have a AI-ready data hackathon trying to do some assessments for both Met Office and NOAA data for different use cases, including climates, urban heat, resilience, as well as the AI for numerical weather prediction. And there is also the World Data System pilot assessments. I think Karen's data center was one of those groups that participated in part of the assessments. And when we are asking the feedback or key takeaways on what's the feedback about using the checklist, it's the two prompted answers. The first one is yes, it is useful. And then instead of yes and, they say yes, but. It's useful, but we can do better on different things related to checklist to make it much more relevant for both the data creators as well as the data repositories. So I'm glad to see many repository people in this room, and we can have some discussion about how this checklist can be useful for the repositories, and then what is next steps we can in the version 2.0 towards version 2.0 to make it useful for the repository as well. So just the one more slides before I get into a quick survey, which is that for it is useful part, as people said, it really helped strengthen some of the discussions on data management and stewardship, especially for some legacy data set that you don't really have enough resource to really do a lot with it. But when you see that used being a lot of machine learning applications, then that gives you more energy as well as your argument to ask for more resources to improve data management for those data sets. And the other ones that bring awareness for additional fields in the data management, like the quality, especially scientific quality, which is hard, but it's an interesting conversation. And we are trying to work with OU and UW. UW, they have NSF grants on bias assessment framework. So we're trying to integrate this bias assessment framework into our checklist as a guidance on how people can answer questions related to the bias in the data set itself. And also it's a good starting point for some of the fair assessments, or you might argue vice versa. So some of the fair assessment can be a good starting point for the AI readiness assessments as well. So the can do better part, I summarize them into 4 different categories. It's why, that providing the motivation for the checklist, why we are doing that. And so people understand what they are getting themselves into, and what is like really defining some of the terms we use in the checklist more clearly to avoid any ambiguity. For example, the bias is sometimes a domain and also data type relevance concept in different ways. And the how part is how to provide those better guidance on doing the assessments and the data set improvements. And the so what questions that, and how can we share the outcomes of the assessments results? Because after if you go through the entire checklist, that's about 40 some questions, and then you have a spreadsheet. And then how do we turn the assessment results into something that's useful both for the data centers as well as for the users who are using those data, right? So that can turn into maybe a number, a score, or a card about the specific data to make it easily useful for the users and for that. And so those are 4 areas for improvements that we are looking into in the version 2.0 for the checklist efforts. So now leads me to everyone's love for QR code and and interactivity on the screen. So if you scan the QR code or use the bit.ly link on the left, which is It leads you to one question survey that asks you to rank all four different aspects that we want to use our time together in this session. So pick the highest interest to you to the lowest interest to you. So just rank it, drag it. So it's a Google form, not Google form, a Microsoft form. It's not Slido this time, so give you some diversity, if we can still use that word. I will go back to my screen let's look at the results together to see a lot of people have responded. We're gonna give a minute or so for us to complete this ranking activity. While we are doing that, any questions or thoughts so far while we're waiting for the responses on the survey? Yeah, QR code is there. The same QR code. Sorry. Yes, Jackie.
Yeah. Hi, Douglas. Thanks. So when you're talking about the data quality assessment portion of the AI checklist, I find that that aspect is more clearly the job for the data provider because we're more intimate with the data sets in a way that others don't know about, others that archive who aren't as intimate with the data sets. And not a but, and having said that, as a data provider, I do find these AI checklists useful for us and to prep our data so that we're empowered to make our data sets like more AI ready instead of having to rely on like a third party person to do that for us.
Right.
And so, yeah, so thanks. It's just a comment that data quality is usually something that is the purview of the data provider.
Yeah. Thanks.
Unless,
Yeah. Thanks, Jackie. I think you are definitely right because when you ask the data managers to really do the assessment, they might not knows the in and out of that data, and so often take them a lot of times to really find those information can be used to answer those questions. So I think when we created that tool, we are thinking about for the data provider or the data creator itself as well, because if they have this a list, they can directly consider when they are creating those data sets, like can they providing those information more clearly in a way that can make it easier for people to find those information. So that's we had the success to one of the NOAA 2 years ago, NOAA CPO started including the checklist as a guideline for the grantees to consider when they are creating machine learning data sets. So they included that as a guideline for them to consider. It's not a requirement, it's guideline, it's better than nothing. So that's one thing. Okay, thanks. Any other comments or thoughts, either in person or online? All right. Now, here, based on the 33 of you who responded to this tool, this survey, I think the highest priority goes to provide better guidance on how to assess and improve. And the second ranking is the define the terms clearly to avoid ambiguity, and then like how to share the outcomes in the third place. And the why. I see Ken has a comments. I'm not sure, Ken, can you unmute yourself or
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, anybody who's heard me talk in like the last year has probably heard me say something like this. And I love the checklist, and I think this work is great. The thing I want to try to incorporate into the discussions, though, is how AI readiness is, in my view, is as much about the system that is stewarding and serving the data as it is about any of the characteristics of the individual data sets being served. And I would love to see us sort of factor that into the discussion, because you can have, the world's like most amazing data set, but if you have to drive down to the McDonald's and park in the back and walk across the street and, I don't know, get it on a CD-ROM from somebody in the alley behind the McDonald's, it's not going to be very AI ready, right? I mean, and I know some of the AI checklist questions are about accessibility, so maybe that's a terrible metaphor or analogy, but I want to figure out how we can start talking about the systems that are serving this AI ready data, not just the individual data sets themselves.
Thanks, Ken. I realized I have been the people online can only see a gray box while Ken was talking. So, but we'll come back, and I do have one person online. I want her to introduce herself. Rebecca, are you able to unmute yourself? Rebecca, right now is a student intern working with me, doing some of the policy analysis. Just going to respond to Ken's comments about the system, and I think that goes to the policy and guidelines on how to implement or inform those systems. Rebecca, are you there?
Yes, hello.
Hey, Rebecca, do you want to introduce yourself and then say a few words about the work you're doing through the internship?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a master's student, and I'm interning with the NOAA Center for AI over the summer. I'm just doing a little bit of comparative research across different federal agencies and institutions, um, eh, both federally and internationally, about different policies related to AI and data. And hopefully I'll be able to come up with some recommendations for NOAA and address some of those larger systemic challenges that are important to consider right now.
Thanks, Rebecca. Okay, and so any other questions, comments before we move on to more breakout and those discussions? No? Okay. I guess everyone's getting ready to get hands dirty. So can you create breakouts for the people online? I want putting everyone online into one breakout rooms. And so I'm gonna navigate back to the notes documents that included a few of the resources, the notes documents to take. Okay. Okay, this is not this one, it's this one. So we have created a few of the notes documents that where everyone is going into different groups and to have some discussion. If you are ready to jump into getting some work done, great. If not, you just want to have some conversations about those topics, great too. And so there's no need for you to walk out the room because you haven't seen the checklist for 30 minutes. And so here we have three topics. One is developing checklist primers, and that can be for the data providers for different roles, right? For primers for data providers, primers for data users, and primers for data manager or data centers. That would be, because you can think about how those may be different. For data providers, it's really think about why this checklist or the AI readiness assessment is useful and how the data centers can be part of the process. And then for the people who are interested in improving the checklist, that there's a document link with a link to all the information from the WDS World Data System pilot program feedback for that. And then for the there's also how to present the assessment results. And so think about the way you would like to see the checklist results to be presented, or as either as a score or things like that. So for the people online, I'm just trying to think about if there's, oh, people already left, I guess. That's the problem. They already joined the breakout rooms. Okay, great. For those people who haven't joined breakout rooms, I would encourage you to go into a breakout room, choose one of the topics for the people online. So to have the conversation, a discussion. And for the people who, Debashi, can you go into the breakout rooms, just type in, let them know about this? And for people online, for people in the room, I would like to just split into 3 groups based on the numbers that we have here. And so you can choose either topics of your interest. So I'm gonna split based on region, based on the spatial clusters. So that would be my first cluster on this side. And the 2 rows behind, okay, the row 1, 2, 3 on my left side would be one group, and the row 4 to 6 on my left side would be another group. And we have 30 minutes. You can pick topics for your own groups that pick topics, right? Yes, right. Okay. I think, okay, we have the suggestion to do it the other way. I'm gonna get the data center people together to see if you want to develop a primer for the data center and how this checklist can be used for a data center. And for the data center people, please go to my right side together. I hope. And for the rest, I hope you can talk about the primers for data providers and data users. So let's just refine it to 2 groups, and so have more focused discussion. Sounds good? And for the data center, please use group A documents. And for the data users and data providers, please use group B documents. Here, data A for the providers and data B for the users. Great, thanks for the people who typed that in. Group A, group B. Let them do the group C. Yeah, use the group C for the primers, group C.
I'll just say choose group C and work on it.
Yep.
It automatically generates.
For validation purposes.
Along with all
Engineer,
standard metadata, all of it.
like the unattractive thing.
Right.
is-
Right. We have people coming back from online as well as people who are in person. Give it another. Right. Welcome back, everyone. I want to see if we can have a general conversation and discussion starting by each group, just summarizing some of the conversations happening in each group. I'm going to start with online group, and I know Ken, and I'm just going to name Ken to do some summarizing of what the online group
Sure.
has talked about. Yeah.
Sure. We had a lot of fun because we all sort of immediately started talking about, hey, well, Google Gemini or Copilot, how could we use this to help us write these primers? So we did a lot of that and experimenting and tweaking, and we put the different versions here in the document. One of the things we kind of got toward the end was how like started like, okay, it's one thing to like have this big long summary, but what are like the 5 key recommendations coming out of the checklist, and using that as the primer. So we have a couple versions of that in here. So that's the really high level summary. That's what we kind of ended up with. And I think I don't know, it was fun for me. And I think that this is a great place where some of these tools can really be useful.
Thanks, Ken. Anyone online want to add or share your own perspective? By the way, nice arts in the back with the Noah meeples on it.
Yeah, it's my daughter's handiwork.
Awesome. If there's no other people online, we're gonna go to, I'm gonna name Matt. Matt Jones from Arctic Data Center and NCs.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, we had a discussion about the primer from the perspective of a repository. It was a good discussion. I think the initial struggle was around figuring out what the purpose of a primer would be and who it serves. And then we identified two different audiences. So both repository managers that are trying to probably generate these summaries, and then repository data consumers that are trying to utilize them for understanding data sets. And we felt like both of those use cases were useful here. So we broke up the primer, and I think we said that there should be probably four major sections: this audience, the purpose, a motivation, and then how people can go about filling it out effectively. We had a nice conversation around how there's kind of a difference between a high-level assessment of the whole repository versus more detailed assessments for individual data sets that help people judge that data set. There's a bunch of ideas of things in here that we thought we should be answering in the primer, but we didn't get to fill those out. But we did agree that I think at the end that it would be useful to have a high level summary in any given checklist of like how a particular data set might have fared so that researchers can use that. So the analogy people came up with was a consumer reports type of synopsis of a data set that sort of said on uncertainty, this, gets a half circle, and on, great documentation, this gets, a full circle, and on annotation and labeling, it hasn't been done, so it gets a empty circle. So that kind of like synopsis, like at a glance, how useful is this data set would be a really nice outcome for a lot of data sets for folks. Yeah, anything else that I didn't cover from the group?
Thanks, Matt. You're talking about label or summarizing a synopsis of those assessments. One of the related initiatives going on is called data nutrition label, which they draw the idea from the food nutrition label. So they created 4 different categories of the things they're providing a nutrition label for that specific data set, which is really interesting efforts going on, and that's specific for data set that use for machine learning. They are having a lot of those things related to social economic data, like those data being used for some of those facial recognitions and other things that they want to make sure there's no bias related to different factors. So it's quite fascinating to see their example labels, which is they had good like front end designers as well. So, and I forgot ask your name. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Maya, by the way. Yeah, so we had a wonderful discussion, somewhat a little more broad, but it kind of revealed a tension between this acknowledgement that our end user increasingly is not necessarily a human, meaning not necessarily a person who's going to very carefully be studying a metadata checklist or scorecard. It's more likely than not going to be in an LLM that's going to be scraping our website, and we can only hope to pass something along for the ride that does our data justice and is recognizable to that tool. And so some of the things that were pointed out as useful things to think about is the stack technology, which are data type that can be kind of added on top as an extension to your data that is, relevant to the checklist, but is easily crawlable by these LLM search tools, along with just kind of simple nuts and bolts things like really explicit unit definition. Is wind speed in feet per second or meters per second? There was also some discussion about providing, whether we're talking about within a coding vignette or just, a simple text thing, for example, on a repo, how to use these data in an LLM context. So you, meaning the person providing the data, doing some, behind the scenes experimentation with the more dominant language models and saying, hey, when we used Claude, it wasn't really reliable, but when we used, ChatGPT, it did this, and here are the prompts that fared well. That's not necessarily like a, hardcore recommendation that everyone agreed on, but it's an example of the type of, I think, ecosystem that we acknowledge we're working in, where we're not necessarily going to be able to interact with individual human users, even at distance. Anything else folks in our group want to share?
Thanks, Mile. Yeah, and I think when we started this checklist, that's before ChatGPT and generative AI is a thing. So, and things need to be updated with the current affairs as well. So there are things we need to do here. And so thanks for all the conversation discussion. And I want to open it up to much more broad feedback on what you would like to see, or what would it be helpful on the things related to checklist here, whether you are managing a data repository or you are creating a data sets that could be used in AI ML applications, or you're managing an entire program that provides the data. I'm not looking at a specific person. Ken, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Douglas. Yeah, one of the things I'm interested in is if where things are with respect to trying to build automated tools for for using the checklist behind the scenes to do an automated assessment of the AI readiness of the data sets. And from a from someone who runs a repository's perspective, I think that would be incredibly fantastic to have a more automated way of assessing readiness.
We won't be able to fully automate, just because if you look at some of the questions, that it's much more like nuanced and that requires human intervention. We do have so there's two routes we're doing right now. The first route is basically doing based on the metadata and to automatically complete some of those answers in the checklist, and that's the one route. The other one we are doing right now is with the large language model as well. So with Gemini, that being able to use by NOAA. So we have been using Gemini to ask Gemini to do assessment for specific data sets.
I was going to ask whether you were doing exactly that. So that's really exciting to hear. Are you guys going to be presenting those results anywhere anytime soon?
We will think about where to present. And so definitely we're gonna try to get the results like public or share the lessons learned in those efforts as well.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and we also had a conversation with Matt early on, just like some of the questions, it's really hard to automate in those quality checks. And so that and it'd be nice if everything has metadata, but we don't. Yes, Tom, right?
So one of the things that we talked about was sort of rather than trying to assess the checklist, is think of a CI/CD pipeline that works off prompts that for specific tasks with specific known answers that you can think of as just iteratively running and saying, if it runs to completion and gives you the right answer, then it's finding the data it needs, the metadata and the data it needs to process your data in an automated automatic LLM generated workflow. So it's sort of proof is in the pudding. We don't know how the LLMs work, and no one really does. But if it works, and we can advertise that. And that is sort of a de facto statement of AI readiness.
Thanks, Tom. I think you got some fan online from Ken Casey. Other comments, thoughts, or ideas? Yes, Ken in the room.
Thank you, Rob Casey, Earthscope. So the thought that occurred to me in terms of my interest in wanting to engage with such a checklist is I hope to learn something from it. So I hope that a set of qualified scores would result in it would turn things around to a list of recommendations. It's like, you got scored low on this, we suggest you do such and such and such and such. We think, in general, we find that having these qualities is very important in a data repository or a data set. So we recommend you take this course of action to improve your score there. So that way we'll get something back that helps us to improve.
Thanks, Rob. Yes, definitely the idea of using the checklist as a way to inform the improvement or the next steps would be really useful for sure. Others? Please online, Bhaskar or? Right.
Yeah, thank you, Douglas. This is Bhaskar. I'm the project scientist at LadStack at Goddard. So here's my sort of question. I've been following the semantic technologies for the last couple of decades or so. And I notice, I mean, I'm not so much involved in AI ML, but I noticed the original semantic tech, the stack, I should say, the technology stack. There's a lot of you know, it has roots in the original AI. When I say AI, I'm talking of AI going back to the late 50s and 60s. You know? And but I noticed that, you know, over time, except for certain groups, they have. It's almost like they've given up on some of the methodology, the frameworks that are made possible by semantic web technologies. For instance, you know, FAIR, the interoperability of FAIR is a very, very slippery slope, essentially because of the inability to implement semantic interoperability. And that's one of the reasons why on the NASA Earth Science data products, we don't have a, you know, a good answer for why it's not totally fair, you know, in terms of the interoperability. So my question is basically, because there are threads tying the original semantic web stack to AI, and then there are two groups in ESIP as well. You have the semantic technologies and your particular group. So is there any sort of synergies that you are trying to leverage between the two, or or in any way are you trying to sort of make the most of those common threads that bind them together?
Right. Thanks, Bhaskar. And right now, we haven't had a lot of the direct interaction with semantic technology groups within ESIP, but I think that's a really important part we need to engage with, especially when we are trying to move ahead, especially on some of the automation and all those activities need to go ahead. And so that is one. And I want to see if any other online or in person have. Matt has a hand raised. Matt Jones from NCs.
Yeah, it's not really connected to the checklist, but I wanted to mention that the Cyber 2A project, which is focused on learning resources for AI for geoscience, has a webinar coming up on August 18th, where Marshall Ma from the semantic cluster at ESIP is going to talk about semantic enrichment and its use in LLM analytics, and how they're applying that at Mindat. So I think there are connections between the clusters that could be further developed, but I think that's going to be a great webinar that's open to folks, and I'll post something in the ESIP Slack about it for folks to see. But
thanks, Matt. Sorry. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? If not, I just want to thank everyone for joining this session today, and also please join us in our monthly calls. I know we have some colleagues from Australia. Our call time might not necessarily be the best time for Australian colleagues to join us. We're usually in the middle of the day on the East Coast, but we're trying to figure out a way maybe we can do some rotation of the time so we can be more inclusive to other colleagues outside of US to join the discussion and conversation as well. And you can always join our mailing list through the ESIP website, the data readiness cluster, and we will follow up and summarizing all the things we have done in the session and in the ESIP cluster mailing list, and to continue some of the work in our monthly calls starting from next month. All right, thanks everyone, and we have maybe 5-minute break until 5 extra minutes break for than everyone else. Grab coffee. Thank you.